Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Viking Age, raiders, traders, and explorers. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The sea at this hour is the color of pewter, flat and cold and vast, stretching away to the north in every direction until it becomes indistinguishable from the sky. The light is low and lateral, coming from a sun that barely clears the horizon even at midday in this season. And it lays itself across the water in long silver bars that shift and dissolve with the movement of the swells. The air tastes of salt and cold iron. The wind is steady from the north, carrying with it something ancient and clean, the smell of deep water, of distances, of a world without edges. You are standing on the shore of a fjord somewhere in the north of what will one day be called Norway. And the year is perhaps the 8th century. And the evening is coming on with the slow deliberateness of northern evenings. The light refusing to leave all at once but withdrawing gradually, reluctantly, turning the world by degrees from silver to gray to a blue so dark it seems almost purple. Somewhere behind you, up the slope from the shore, a fire has been lit in a longhouse, and its warmth and its smell of wood smoke and roasting meat press against your back. Below you, drawn up on the shingle, the long dark shape of a ship rests in the gathering dark. Tonight we move slowly through one of the most restless and far-reaching civilizations of the medieval world. The Norse, the people we call Vikings, who exploded out of Scandinavia in the late 8th century and spent the next 300 years reshaping the known world. They were raiders, yes, as history has remembered them, but they were also merchants of extraordinary range. Settlers who planted communities from Greenland to Russia. Explorers who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Poets who composed some of the most compelling literature of the Middle Ages. And craftsmen whose work in wood and iron and gold was among the finest produced anywhere in their era. Let the shore hold you. Let the cold air of the north press gently against your face. We are in no hurry tonight. There is only the sea, and the ship, and the long patient story of the people who understood both. To understand the Norse world, you must first understand the landscape that made it. Scandinavia is a place of extremes, of fjords that cut so deep into the mountainous coastline that they feel like wounds, their sheer cliff walls rising hundreds of feet straight from the black water. Of forests of pine and birch that cover the inland hills in dense dark masses. the light within them greenish and dim at midsummer and all but absent in the long winter. Of a coastline so convoluted, so fractured by islands and inlets and peninsulas, that traveling it by sea is often faster than attempting to cross the mountains that block the interior. The sea, in Scandinavia, is not an obstacle to travel. It is the road. It is the highway, the market, the meeting place, the source of food and the route to adventure. Children grew up with the sound of it constant in their ears. Men and women measured distance in days of sailing rather than miles of walking. And the boats they built to travel that sea, the long, elegant, shallow-drafted vessels that are among the greatest technological achievements of the medieval world, were the product of centuries of incremental refinement, of small improvements handed down from father to son through generations of shipwrights who understood wood and water the way a musician understands sound. The longship. Even the word carries a particular weight, a particular resonance. Let the image of it form in your mind, not the cartoon image of a wide, high-sided vessel with a horned helmet nailed to the prow, but the real thing, narrow, so narrow that a person standing amidships can almost touch both gunwales with outstretched arms. Low in the water, barely 18 inches of freeboard, so that the sea on rough days would have sloshed over the sides and the crew would have bailed constantly. Clinker-built, meaning the overlapping planks of oak were riveted together with iron and then the seams were caulked with tarred wool, making the hull flexible rather than rigid, able to bend with the waves rather than fight them. The keel was long and shallow, a design that meant the ship could be beached directly on a shore, no harbor required, and that it drew so little water it could sail up rivers far into the interior of continents. The sail was square, woven wool in stripes of red and white or ochre and brown, and when it filled with a good wind, the ship moved with a speed that astonished anyone who saw it for the first time. In a strong following breeze, a longship could cover more than 100 miles in a single day. The people who built and sailed these ships lived in a world organized around the concept of the clan, the extended family network, bound by blood and loyalty and mutual obligation, that provided the basic unit of social life. At the head of a clan was the Jarl, a lord, a chieftain, and below him were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who made up the backbone of Norse society, and below them the thralls, the enslaved people who worked the farms and households. The jarldom was not inherited in a simple way. It had to be earned and maintained through reputation, through generosity to followers, through success in trading and raiding and the complex social performance of being someone whose company was worth having. The Great Hall, the Mead Hall, was the stage on which this performance was conducted. Long and low, built of timber and turf, its interior was a single large space dominated by a central hearth whose smoke rose through a hole in the roof and whose light was the warm, unsteady light of fire, throwing long shadows across the carved wooden posts and the faces of the men and women seated along the benches that lined the walls. In those halls, the poets, the skalds, composed and performed. The skaldic tradition is one of the most technically demanding poetic traditions in the history of human literature. The verse forms it employed were intricate almost beyond modern comprehension, governed by strict rules of meter and alliteration and internal rhyme. And the language of skaldic poetry was itself a kind of second language, a layered, elusive tongue that made use of kennings, compound phrases that substituted for ordinary words in highly figurative ways. The sea was the whale road, or the gannet's bath. Gold was fire of the river, or tears of Freya. A warrior was a feeder of ravens. Battle was the storm of swords, or the din of shields. To compose in this tradition required years of study, a vast memory for mythological reference, and a musician's ear for sound. The skalds were valued and rewarded accordingly. A great skald at the court of a Norse king was a keeper of reputation, a maker of immortality, because the poems preserved in memory and eventually in writing were the primary way in which a king's deeds were transmitted to posterity. To be praised by a great skald was to be remembered. Outside the great halls, the rhythms of daily life for most Norse people were agricultural. The farms of Scandinavia, perched on the narrow strips of cultivable land between the mountains and the sea, or carved into the forests of the interior, were the foundation of everything. Barley and rye were the primary grains, grown in the short northern summer with the intensity of people who knew the harvest window was brief and unforgiving. Hay was cut in vast quantities for the livestock that would need to survive the winter inside. Because the winters of Scandinavia were long and dark and genuinely cold, and the animals that were not fed through those months would be dead by spring. The preserving of food, salting fish, smoking meat, fermenting dairy into skyr and hard cheeses, drying berries and herbs was not a culinary preference but a survival imperative. The Norse winter table was the product of the summer's labor, and the calculation of how much had been stored against how long the cold would last was one of the central anxieties of the agricultural year. The longhouse was home to both people and their most valued animals. Cows and sheep and goats were brought inside during the hardest months, their body heat adding to the warmth of the fire, their smell and their sounds mixing with the smells and sounds of the household. This was not considered strange or undesirable. It was practical, and the Norse were practical people. The building itself was designed for this mixed use, long, with the human quarters at one end and the animal quarters at the other, a central corridor running the full length. The roof pitched steeply to shed the heavy snows that fell for months at a time. The construction was of timber where timber was available and turf where it was not, and the best longhouses were built with a care and an attention to joinery that reflected the same instinct for fine craft that produced the decorated ships and the interlaced carvings. A well-built longhouse was a point of pride. It announced to anyone who saw it the quality of the people who lived there. The mythology that lay behind the kennings, the vast web of stories that gave the skalds their material, is one of the most vivid and psychologically complex bodies of religious thought produced by any pre-Christian culture. The Norse cosmos was a tree Yggdrasil, the world ash, enormous beyond imagining, its roots reaching down into the wells of fate and wisdom, its branches extending through 9 worlds that included Asgard, the realm of the gods, Midgard, the world of human beings, Jotunheim, the world of giants, Niflheim, the realm of ice and cold, and others beside. The gods who lived in Asgard were not perfect beings, not omnipotent creators. They were powerful and often capricious, subject to their own failings and passions and, crucially, mortal. They knew that the world would end. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was not a possibility but a certainty, a future event toward which all of existence was moving, at which the great serpent Jormungandr would rise from the ocean and the wolf Fenrir would break his chains and the gods would go to their final battle and be destroyed. This knowledge did not paralyze the Norse imagination. It sharpened it. If everything ends, then what matters is how one conducts oneself before the end. Odin, the All-Father, the chief of the gods, was not a comfortable deity. He was a seeker, restless, one-eyed, having sacrificed the other eye for a drink from the well of wisdom. He had also hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, wounded by a spear, in order to gain the knowledge of the runes. He was the god of poetry, of wisdom, of death, of war, but also of travelers and of those who operated at the margins of ordinary society. The wanderer in the gray cloak who appears at the crossroads and offers knowledge at a price. He collected the souls of great warriors for Valhalla, his hall in Asgard, because he was building an army for Ragnarok. He sent his ravens Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, to fly through the 9 worlds every day and return to his shoulders to whisper what they had seen. He was the embodiment of a particular Norse sensibility. The conviction that knowledge and wisdom are worth any price, and that certainty is not available, and that one must act anyway, in the dark, with incomplete information, and accept the consequences. Thor was easier. The hammer-wielding son of Odin was the protector of Midgard, the enemy of the giants who threatened the ordered world. And he was enormously popular among the ordinary farmers and craftsmen of the Norse world, people who wanted not wisdom but protection, not poetry but weather. And Thor was the god of thunder and storms and therefore of the rain that fell on crops and the lightning that could destroy them. His hammer Mjolnir was the supreme weapon, capable of flattening mountains and slaying giants and then returning to his hand. Representations of Mjolnir, small hammer pendants made of iron or silver, have been found in Norse archaeological contexts all across the known world, from Iceland to Russia, worn around the necks of people who wanted the god's protection close to their skin. When Christianity came north, hammer pendants and cross pendants existed side by side for a while, the old protection and the new sitting together against the same chest, as if the wearer was not quite sure which divine power might be needed and preferred to be prepared for both. Death was taken seriously in the Norse world, and the rituals surrounding it were elaborate and revealing. The most spectacular of Norse burials involved ships, the body of a great person laid in a longship, surrounded by their possessions and sometimes by sacrificed animals and occasionally by other people. The whole assembly then covered with a great mound of earth that could be seen from the sea. The Oseberg Mound in Norway, excavated in the early 20th century, contained a ship of extraordinary quality and 2 women buried within it with a collection of objects, the carved sledges and cart and bed posts, textiles of remarkable preservation, kitchen equipment, horses and cattle. That suggests one of the women was a person of very high status and the other perhaps her companion or servant. The identity of the high-status woman remains debated. Some scholars have suggested she might have been a Volva, a seeress, a woman who practiced cedar, the shamanic form of magic associated in the Norse tradition with Odin and with certain women who could journey between worlds to seek knowledge of the future. The afterlife, in Norse belief, was not a single place. Warriors who died in battle, and specifically those chosen by the Valkyries, went to Valhalla, Odin's great hall in Asgard, where they feasted and fought and feasted again, preparing for Ragnarok. But most people did not die in battle and did not go to Valhalla. They went to hell, not a place of punishment, but a gray and quiet realm beneath the earth, ruled by the goddess of the same name, a place of continuation rather than reward or torment. Others went to the realm of the sea god Njord, or to Freya's Hall Sessrumner. The dead were thought to remain connected to the living, capable of blessing or troubling the household, capable of being addressed and sometimes of responding, part of the extended community of the farm that included the dead as well as the living. Burial mounds on family land were not merely graves but presences, parts of the landscape that carried meaning and required respect. The Norse relationship with their dead was intimate in a way that later Christian practice would change but never quite extinguish. Let the fire in the longhouse warm you for a moment. The wind outside has picked up. You can hear it working around the corners of the building, pressing against the turf walls, sending small cold drafts across the floor, but inside the hall the warmth is deep and animal. The smell is wood smoke and wet wool and the particular smell of many bodies close together in a space not designed for ventilation. The central hearth is large and its fire is well fed, and the light it throws across the carved posts and the weapons hanging on the walls and the faces of the people seated along the benches is warm and mobile, making everything seem slightly alive, slightly in motion. Someone is playing a stringed instrument in the far corner, a simple drone, a repeated pattern, and above it a voice is beginning to compose, finding the shape of a new verse, testing words against each other in the firelight. Let your breathing slow. Let the warmth of the hearth find you. There is no urgency here. The night is long, as northern nights are, and there is time for stories. The raids began in earnest toward the end of the 8th century. The reasons are debated, perhaps a growing population pressing against the limited agricultural land of Scandinavia, perhaps improvements in ship technology that made long voyages feasible for the first time, perhaps political disruptions within the Norse world that sent the losers of local power struggles outward across the sea looking for new resources. Probably all of these things at once, in the way that large historical movements rarely have single causes but accumulate from the convergence of many pressures. The first recorded Viking raid on the British Isles struck the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England, In the year 793, the monastery was wealthy, poorly defended, and situated on a small island easily accessible from the sea. Precisely the profile that Norse raiders would return to again and again. The monks who survived described the event in terms of horror and divine punishment, and their accounts gave the world its first clear picture of what a Viking raid was. Fast, violent,
Focus dont portable Wells,
and over before any response could be organized. The speed was the key. A longship could cover the North Sea in a matter of days. It could appear on a coast that had never seen such a vessel, disgorge a small force of armed men, take what was valuable, and be back at sea before any regional defense could be mounted. The reach was extraordinary, not only Britain and Ireland, where Norse raiding and then settlement transformed the political landscape over the following century, but also the Frankish coasts of what is now France and the Low Countries, the rivers of what is now Germany, and eventually the Iberian Peninsula and even the Mediterranean, where Norse ships were sighted and Norse raiders made landfall in places that had no framework for understanding what these northern people were. A Norse force sacked the city of Seville in the 840s and raided into the interior of what is now Spain. Another group raided the coast of Morocco. The longship, given a favorable wind and men willing to sail until the sea itself told them to stop, had made the world smaller and more dangerous than it had ever been. But the violence is only one face of the Norse expansion, and not even the most consequential one. In the same period that raids were striking the monasteries of Ireland and the farmlands of England, Norse merchants were opening one of the most extensive trading networks of the medieval world. The Varangian routes, from the Norse word for the trading paths that ran south from Scandinavia through the river systems of what is now Russia, connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, linking the Norse world to Byzantium and to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The great rivers of Russia, the Volga, the Dnieper, were the highways of this trade, and the Norse merchants and adventurers who traveled them, known to the Slavic peoples they encountered as the Rus, a word that may have given Russia its name, carried furs and amber and slaves southward and brought back silver, silk, spices, and the coins of the Caliphate northward. Thousands of Arab silver dirhams have been found in hoards buried across Scandinavia by Norse traders who never returned to collect them, each coin a small testament to the extraordinary reach of the trade network they had built. The weight of those coins in the hand, thin and pale and inscribed with Arabic script that the Norse trader who buried them could not read, connects two worlds that seem from the perspective of later history, impossibly distant from each other. The mead halls of Norway and the market cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, linked by the long cold rivers of Russia and the desire for silver that drove men across the known world and beyond it. The Norse were not squeamish about doing business with people very different from themselves. Trade was trade. Silver was silver. The quality of a man's word and the fairness of his weights mattered more than the name of his god. The city of Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in what is now Sweden, was one of the great commercial centers of this Norse trading world. Founded perhaps in the 8th century, it was for 200 years a place where merchants from across the known world came to buy and sell. Arab traders who had come up from the south with silver and silk, Frankish merchants from the Rhine Valley with wine and weapons and glassware, local Norse farmers with furs and iron and the honey that the northern forests produced in abundance. Archaeologists who have excavated Birka have found artifacts from as far away as Central Asia and the Middle East alongside objects of purely local manufacture. And the picture that emerges is of a cosmopolitan, bustling, multilingual market town, not the village of romantic imagination, but a real commercial hub, with its own rules and its own seasonal rhythms and its own population of full-time traders who understood the price of silver in Constantinople and could calculate exchange rates across 3 currencies without writing anything down. The Norse settlements in the British Isles left marks that are still visible, not as ruins and monuments, but as words. The English language absorbed an enormous number of Norse borrowings during the period of Viking settlement, and many of the words most fundamental to the fabric of daily life in English are Norse in origin. Sky. Window from Vindaga, meaning wind-eye. Knife. Husband. Egg. Ugly. Happy. Awkward. The words for the days of the week: Tuesday from Tyr, Wednesday from Odin, Thursday from Thor, Friday from Frigg, are a daily invocation of the Norse pantheon by people who have long since forgotten they are doing it. The place names of northern and eastern England, the region known as the Danelaw, where Norse settlers established themselves in the 9th and 10th centuries, are riddled with Norse elements. Any place name ending in by, meaning farm or village, or thorp, meaning outlying settlement, or thwaite, meaning a clearing, preserves in its syllables the presence of people who came from across the North Sea and stayed, who farmed the English soil and married English women and raised children who spoke something between Norse and English and eventually became simply English, carrying the northern blood and the northern words without knowing their origin. The city of Jorvik, modern York, in the north of England, offers perhaps the most vivid window into what Norse urban settlement actually looked like. The Vikings took York in the year 866 and held it, with interruptions, for nearly a century. Archaeologists excavating beneath the modern city in the 1970s and 80s, in a project that became famous in British archaeology, found a remarkable thing: a Norse city preserved in the waterlogged ground, its timber structures still standing to significant heights, the streets intact, its refuse pits full of organic material that was analyzed with the tools of the 20th century to give a detailed picture of life in the 9th. They found the remains of workshops, amber being worked into pendants, antler being carved into combs, iron being beaten into nails and tools, leather being worked into shoes of sophisticated construction. They found the seeds of plants eaten and the bones of animals butchered and the parasites that lived in the intestines of the city's inhabitants, preserved in the ancient soil with unsettling completeness. They found the artifacts of daily life, cups and bowls and gaming pieces and textile tools, that make the past suddenly specific and near. The picture that emerged from Jorvik was not of raiders passing through, but of settlers who had come to stay, who built permanent structures, who practiced trades, who maintained the commercial life of a city that had been an important Roman and Anglo-Saxon center before they arrived. The Norse did not destroy the cities they settled. They inhabited them, adapted them, added to them. The trade networks they brought with them connected Jorvik to Dublin, another Norse city, one of the most important trading centers in the Irish Sea world, and through Dublin and Jorvik to the broader Norse commercial sphere, linking the north of England to the Baltic and the rivers of Russia by the long chain of exchange that constituted the Norse economic world. Iceland was different. There were no people to displace. The island large, volcanically active, magnificently inhospitable in many of its regions, with its lava fields and its geysers and its glaciers and its perpetual wind, had been visited by Irish monks seeking solitude sometime before the Norse arrived. And those monks left when the Norse came, because solitude was precisely what they would no longer have. The Norse settlement of Iceland, which began in earnest around the 870s, was one of the most deliberate colonization projects of the medieval world. Families and their livestock and their tools and their household gods, loading everything onto ships and making the 3-day crossing from Norway to start again on an island that had no existing human infrastructure whatsoever. They came partly to escape the growing consolidation of power in Norway under Harald Fairhair, a king who was successfully unifying the country and thereby ending the independence of the regional chieftains who preferred to rule themselves. Iceland offered freedom, land, and distance from kings. What the Norse settlers built in Iceland is remarkable. Within a few generations, they had created a sophisticated commonwealth, the Althing, established around 930, was a parliament of sorts, a gathering of free landowners that met annually at Thingvellir, the plain of the assembly, to legislate, to hear legal cases, to settle disputes, and to conduct the business of the community. It was not a democracy in any modern sense, and the voices of women and thralls and landless men carried little weight. But it was a form of self-governance unusual in the medieval world, a society without a king, operating by law rather than by the sword of a sovereign. The Icelandic legal tradition was elaborate and precise, and cases were argued by specialists whose knowledge of the law was extensive and whose rhetorical skill in presenting it was considerable. Law in Iceland was a form of performance art as well as a social technology. And Iceland produced the sagas, the great prose narratives that were written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, drawing on oral traditions that stretched back to the settlement period, are among the most extraordinary documents in the history of world literature. The sagas of the Icelanders, or the family sagas, tell the stories of the early settlers and their descendants across several generations, with a prose style that is spare, precise, and psychologically acute to a degree that feels startlingly modern. There is no equivalent of them anywhere in medieval European literature. Characters are drawn with economy and precision. A man is described in a few sentences, his appearance and his temperament, and then the narrative moves, and the character's actions over the following years confirm and complicate and deepen what was said in those first sentences. Women in the sagas are not decorative. They are agents, plotters, keepers of grievances, people who remember insults and bide their time and act when the moment is right. The violence in the sagas is usually the consequence of honor, of the intricate, demanding code that governed what a person owed to themselves and their family and what could be forgiven and what could not. Greenland was next, and beyond it the edge of the world as the Norse knew it. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for killing a man, sailed west from Iceland around the year 985 and found the large island that he named Greenland, reportedly because he thought the encouraging name would attract settlers. It worked. He returned to Iceland, gathered a fleet of ships, and led a colonization expedition to the new land. Not all the ships made it. The crossing was rough and the island was far, but enough arrived to establish 2 settlement areas on the southwestern coast, where the climate in that era was somewhat warmer than it is today, and where the land, though not rich, could support sheep and cattle and the hunting of seal and walrus. The Greenland Norse would live there for nearly 500 years, maintaining connection with Iceland and with Europe through the trade in walrus ivory that their northern location made possible. Before the combination of cooling climate and the collapse of the ivory market and possibly other pressures caused the settlements to fail sometime in the 15th century. And then, from Greenland, the final leap. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, raised in Greenland, a man who had converted to Christianity and had been sent by King Olaf of Norway to bring the new faith to Greenland, sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000 and found what he called Vinland. The sagas describe what he encountered: a land of forests and rivers and grassy meadows, of wild grapes or perhaps wild berries, of a climate milder than Greenland. A settlement was attempted. The sagas describe 2 expeditions, led by Leif's brother Thorvald and later by a more ambitious colonist named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought men and women and cattle and the intention to stay. They encountered the indigenous people, called Skrælings in the sagas, and relations were initially cautious and then violent, and eventually the Norse withdrew. The settlement lasted perhaps 3 or 4 years. And then it was over, and the memory of it faded into the sagas, dismissed by later European historians as legend, until in the 1960s archaeologists excavating at Lance Aux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement, turf longhouses, iron rivets, a bronze pin of the type common in Norse contexts, and proved that the sagas had been telling the truth. 500 years before Columbus. 500 years before the voyage that European history decided to call the discovery of America. On the wind-scoured headland at Lance Aux Meadows, where the sea is cold and the sky is enormous and the grass bends flat in the prevailing wind, Norse people had built their houses and lit their fires and looked out at a continent they did not know how to use, and had eventually gone home. The site is preserved now, a UNESCO World Heritage location, and you can walk through the reconstructed turf longhouses and stand in the dim interior and smell the peat and feel the weight of what happened here, the furthest reach of a people who were, perhaps, the most adventurous seafarers the world has ever produced. The night has deepened over the fjord. The fire has burned lower. its light more intimate now, its heat more concentrated around the hearth. The people in the hall have grown quieter. Some have found their sleeping places along the benches, pulled their cloaks around themselves. Let the warmth of the hall and the accumulated weight of the evening carry them down towards sleep. Outside, the wind has softened, and the fjord is perfectly still, its surface a dark mirror catching the stars that have come out in numbers beyond counting. The long ship on the shingle is a dark shape, patient and at rest, its lines visible against the pale shore. The snow on the mountains above the fjord catches whatever light there is and holds it. The world is very still. Let your breathing slow with it. The conversion of the Norse world to Christianity was not a single event but a process. Slow, uneven, contested, and never quite complete in the sense that the old traditions never entirely disappeared but were absorbed and transformed and carried forward in disguise. The first Norse rulers to convert did so largely for political reasons. Christianity offered connections to the larger European political world. Legitimacy in the eyes of Christian kings and the Church. Access to the literate administrative traditions that Christian institutions had developed. But individual conversion was also, for some, genuine. Olaf Haraldsson, who became Saint Olaf of Norway and died at the Battle of Stiklestad in the year 1030 fighting to impose Christianity on a resistant population, was by all accounts a man of genuine, if sometimes ferocious piety. His death made him a martyr, and his cult spread quickly through Scandinavia. The absorption of Norse culture into Christian Europe did not erase what it absorbed. The sagas were written down by Christian Icelanders who seemed to feel no particular contradiction in preserving the stories of their pagan ancestors with affection and care. The mythological poems of the Poetic Edda, collected and possibly composed in Iceland in the 13th century, give the Norse religious tradition a written record of extraordinary richness, preserving the stories of Odin and Thor and Loki and Freyr and Freya in a form that has survived to the present day. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic poet and historian who wrote the prose Edda in the early 13th century, was a Christian who nonetheless set down the Norse mythological tradition with the evident care of a man who found it beautiful and worth keeping, who understood that in losing the old stories the world would lose something irreplaceable. He was right. The world kept them. Loki deserves a moment. The trickster of the Norse gods is one of the most psychologically complex figures in any mythology, not simply a villain, not simply a helper, but something more slippery and interesting than either. He was a shapeshifter, able to take any form, male or female, animal or human, He was the companion of the gods and also their betrayer. He solved problems with cleverness and then created new problems with the same quality. He fathered monsters, the wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jormungandr, the half-dead goddess Hel who ruled Niflheim, and he also fathered the eight-legged horse Sleipnir, which became Odin's mount. He arranged the death of Baldur, the most beloved of the gods, through a trick of characteristic cleverness and devastating consequence. He was eventually bound beneath the earth, a serpent dripping venom onto his face, and his writhing caused earthquakes. In Loki you can see the Norse ambivalence about intelligence itself, the recognition that cleverness is neither good nor evil but simply a force, capable of both creation and destruction, and that the same quality that solves the most intractable problems will, given time, also cause the worst ones. The craftsmen of the Norse world worked in a tradition of decorative art that is one of the most distinctive visual languages of the medieval period. The animal interlace style, sinuous creatures woven into complex knotwork patterns, biting their own tails or each other's limbs, the whole composition in constant apparent motion, appears on everything from the great carved prows of ships to the small personal brooches and arm rings that Norse men and women wore as markers of wealth and identity. The Oseberg ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway and now displayed in Oslo, carried with it a collection of carved wooden objects, a cart, several sledges, bedposts that are covered in this interlace carving with a density and a skill that leaves modern craftspeople shaking their heads. The people who carved these objects were not making utilitarian objects that happened to be decorated. They were making objects whose decoration was integral to their meaning. The sinuous animal forms were not ornament but content, carriers of a visual cosmology in which the world itself was understood as an interlocking web of living things. Gold and silver were worked with equal care. The Norse hoards, the treasures buried in the earth by people who intended to come back for them and never did, contain objects of astonishing technical accomplishment. Twisted arm rings of pure gold, their surfaces worked with granulation and filigree. Silver brooches of intricate design, their surfaces carrying the same animal interlace in miniature. Amber pendants and glass beads strung on silver wire. The weight of these objects in the hand is significant. They are not light trinkets but substantial things, and their weight was part of their meaning. Wealth in the Norse world was often measured literally by weight, and gold and silver were sometimes cut into pieces, hack silver and hack gold, to be weighed out for specific transactions, the beautiful object sacrificed to the calculation of value. Finding a piece of a gorgeous brooch in a coin hoard, cut apart and weighed and used as currency, gives a particular sharp insight into how the Norse understood beauty and its relationship to utility. The women of the Norse world occupied a more complex social position than is sometimes assumed. They did not go raiding. By and large, though the sagas contain women of formidable character who sometimes direct and enable the violence of the men around them. They could own property. They could divorce their husbands by declaring it before witnesses. They managed the household, which in a Norse context was not a domestic diminishment but a position of genuine authority. Since the household was an economic unit of considerable complexity, managing the production of food and cloth and the maintenance of relationships with neighbors and trading partners and the whole web of social obligation that kept a family in good standing. The keys to the household stores, symbolically important objects, hung from the belt of the mistress of the house, visible markers of her authority. Some women were buried with the tools of their craft, spindles and weaving equipment, needles and shears, the material evidence of textile production that was both economically important and technically demanding. The woven wool sail of a Norse ship, which might require the equivalent of several years of work from a single weaver, was very likely produced by women who understood that their craft was as essential to the ship's performance as the keel or the hull. The world is very quiet now in the longhouse. The fire has settled to deep red coals. Their glow steady and warm, and the breathing of the people sleeping along the benches has deepened and slowed. Outside, the northern lights have come. You can see them through the smoke hole. Great curtains of green and white moving silently across the stars, folding and unfolding with a grace that has no equivalent in the natural world, as if the sky itself were breathing. The Norse called them the Northern Lights and sometimes attributed them to the shields of the Valkyries reflecting the light of heaven. Those warrior women who rode across the sky choosing who would die in battle and who would survive. Let the image of those lights fill you. The cold green fire moving above the fjord, above the sleeping longhouse, above the ship on the shingle. The Norse expansion reached its practical limits by the end of the 10th century. The easy targets had been raided repeatedly and had organized defenses. The settlements that had been established in Ireland, in England, in Normandy, in Iceland and Greenland, had taken root and were developing their own local identities, becoming something other than purely Norse. The trading routes through Russia continued to function for a while, but the political landscape of that region was also changing. The Varangian princes who had established themselves along the great rivers gradually Slavicizing, adopting the language and culture of the people they ruled. In the 11th century, the last great Viking king of England, Harold Hardrada, was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, 3 weeks before the Norman conquest at Hastings. The Normans who defeated the English at Hastings were themselves the descendants of Norse settlers in northern France, Norsemen, Northmen, Normans, who had been given the land around the mouth of the Seine by the Frankish king in the early 10th century and had, within a few generations, become French-speaking Christians who had abandoned the language and the gods of their Norse ancestors while retaining the martial energy and the organizational capacity that those ancestors had bequeathed them. What did the Norse world leave behind? Beyond the place names and the loan words and the strands of DNA woven into the populations of Britain and France and Russia and the North Atlantic islands. It left the sagas, which are still read and translated and adapted. It left the mythological tradition, which has had a second life in the modern imagination far beyond what Snorri Sturluson could have anticipated. The gods of Asgard living now in comic books and films and the names of weekdays, reaching audiences Snorri could not have imagined in numbers he could not have counted. It left a template for exploration, the willingness to sail into genuinely unknown waters, past the edge of the known map, and to name what you found and record where it was that left its traces in the European maritime tradition that followed. And it left a particular sensibility about the relationship between human beings and the forces that surround and exceed them, the sensibility that said, "The world will end, and the gods will die, and none of us will be remembered for long." And knowing this, the only dignified response is to do the thing well while you can, to make the poem beautiful and the ship strong and the blade sharp and the feast generous and the friendship loyal, because these things are what there is. There is something in that sensibility that speaks across the centuries with a directness and an honesty that is difficult to find elsewhere. The Norse were not optimists. They did not believe in the guaranteed triumph of good over evil, in the inevitable progress of history towards some better condition, in divine protection for those who deserved it. They believed in the skill of the person holding the oar and the quality of the ship under their feet and the faithfulness of the people beside them and the grace of a favorable wind when it came. And they sailed anyway, into waters where no map existed, past the edge of what anyone had seen, because the horizon was there and the ship was ready and the wind was fair. Let your thoughts drift now, if they will. The saga is long, and most of it is already behind us, the raids and the settlements, the skalds and the shipwrights, the gods of Asgard preparing for their inevitable end, the explorers standing on the shore of Newfoundland in the cold Atlantic wind. Let all of it become less distinct, less detailed, more like a landscape seen from a great distance. The shape of it still visible, but the individual features blending together. The whole thing becoming simply a sense. Tone. A feeling of something large and cold and beautiful and vital that existed once and left its traces in the world and in the words you use every day without knowing their source. The coals in the hearth have gone from red to gray at their edges. The light they give is very soft now, barely enough to see by. The longhouse mostly dark except for this warm core at its center. The breathing of the people sleeping along the benches is very deep, very even. The breathing of people who have worked hard and eaten well and are now very far down in sleep. The wind outside has stopped entirely. The fjord is a mirror. The northern lights have faded. The stars are very bright and very still and very far away. And the snow on the mountains above the water catches their light and holds it like a cupped hand holds water. Carefully, briefly, aware that it cannot hold it forever. The ship on the shingle is dark and still, its lines beautiful even in this near darkness. The upward sweep of its prow against the pale sky, the long hull resting on the stones as though it has grown there, as though it is an extension of the shore itself. Tomorrow it will go back to sea. Tomorrow the sail will fill and the oars will dip and the cold spray will fly back over the gunwales and the crew will lean into their work and the horizon will open ahead of them again, empty and full of possibility. But tonight it rests. Tonight everything rests. The fjord and the mountains and the longhouse and the fire that is barely fire now. Mostly memory, mostly warmth without light. Let sleep come the way the northern lights come, not all at once, not with announcement, but gradually, silently, great slow curtains of it moving across the sky of your mind, green and white and gold, folding and unfolding. The body is heavy. The thoughts are light now, barely thoughts at all, more like the surface of the fjord, which holds the reflection of things without holding the things themselves. The saga is told. The skald has finished. The hall is dark. The sea is very old. The stars are very old. The ship on the shore is patient and dark and still. Sleep well. The fjord keeps its watch tonight.